Okay, I was also working in those wetlands this summer. My name is Faith Van Winkle, and today I'll be talking to you about my project, Nutrient Dynamics in Constructed Wetlands in the Piasa Creek Watershed. My advisors for this project were Dr. John Sloan and Dr. Lyle Guyon. So researchers are interested in fertilizer use in the Mississippi floodplain because the nutrients in those fertilizers, phosphorus and nitrogen, can have impacts on the environment. When rain occurs and washes those nutrients down into nearby waterways off of a farmer's field, they can make their way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where they promote excessive algal growth, and this excessive algal growth depletes the available oxygen stores, resulting in the dead zone. As of this year, that dead zone is predicted to be around 4,880 square miles. In addition to the strict environmental impacts associated with nutrient pollution, we also see economic costs. These costs arise in industries such as tourism and recreation, but they can also affect areas such as healthcare when people come into contact with waters impacted by these algal blooms. So what can we do? Well, natural and constructed or man-made wetlands are a valuable mitigation resource to combat nutrient pollution because wetlands naturally serve to remove and recycle these nutrients. On this slide, I've depicted the nitrogen cycle within a wetland. There are multiple removal mechanisms, but the primary removal mechanism of interest is would be the denitrification. And this is where the nitrate is converted by bacteria from the soluble or aqueous form into the molecular form, which is released into the atmosphere. Sorry, I'm having presenting difficulties. Oops. All right, so this is the phosphorus cycle within a wetland. It's completely different from the nitrogen cycle in that there is no gaseous removal mechanism. Instead, the main way phosphorus is removed within a wetland is through sedimentation or burial over time within the wetland. In this particular project, we were interested in two constructed or man-made wetlands in the Piasa Creek Watershed, which is part of the greater Mississippi River watershed. And our objectives were to determine whether these wetlands served as a sink or a source for phosphorus in the summer months of June and July, so whether they were contributing phosphorus to the environment or removing phosphorus. And additional objectives were to investigate the nitrogen and carbon cycling within these wetlands. The first wetland, as Annette spoke about earlier, is the upper wetland, which is about 2.5 acres. It's located in Jersey County, Illinois, and it's adjacent to agricultural fields as well as Piasa Creek. In this photograph, you can see the sampling locations from which I sampled over the course of the summer, denoted by those yellow pins. And the agricultural field and Piasa Creek are indicated by those green arrows, so you can see they are very close to this wetland. When water enters the wetland, it will flow from the top down, so it will flow through that slough down into the deep basin and out through the drainage pipe into Piasa Creek. The second wetland that we examined, as Annette mentioned, was the tiered wetland, which used to be that agricultural field, which was farmed for about 100 years. The field itself is about 35 acres, with just 8 acres devoted to constructed wetland cells. It's located in Madison and Jersey counties and was previously that agricultural field. In this photograph, you can see the sampling locations from which I sampled over the course of the summer, as well as Piasa Creek. And then this wetland was designed so that water flows from this cell 7, down through these cells to cell 1 and out an outlet down into Piasa Creek. Over the course of the summer, we did not observe any surface flow. In fact, and there was no water coming out of that outlet. However, there was a broad variation in the conditions within the wetland, with periods of very dry weather and almost no water, and periods where there was a lot of water in the wetland cells. So after I collected water from these wetlands, I would bring them back in bottles and analyze them at the lab and perform vacuum filtration. The filtered and non-filtered samples were analyzed with a total carbon, total nitrogen analyzer for total carbon and total nitrogen content. And then the filtered samples were analyzed with the SmartChem discrete analyzer, which measures the soluble forms of nitrogen and phosphorus, being nitrate, phosphate, and ammonia. Finally, to obtain the total amount of phosphorus within the samples, we had to perform an alkaline persulfate digestion to convert all of that phosphorus tied up in the particulate form into the soluble form. And this was performed in those pressure cookers. The first interesting data or observation we made from the data was that the upper wetland is far more nutrient rich than the tiered wetland in terms of those bioavailable forms of nitrogen and phosphorus. In these graphs, you can see nitrogen and phosphorus, and the nutrient concentrations are graphed over time for a representative wetland cell from each wetland. The green line represents the upper wetland, and the blue line represents the tiered wetland. And the main point for these graphs is simply that green line is much higher than the blue line, indicating that that wetland is much higher in the nutrients than the tiered wetland. This nutrient-enriched status of the upper wetland reflects is reflected in the vegetation status. So if we look at the photo in the left for the upper wetland, we see that it is far more densely vegetated than the wetland on the right, which is more sparsely vegetated. And this again just reflects the availability of those soluble forms of phosphorus and nitrogen. When we look at the total nitrogen composition and break it down, we see some interesting differences between the two wetlands. Here in this graph, I have the total nitrogen, and it's broken down into dissolved nitrogen or nitrate in orange and particulate nitrogen in blue. The 3 bars on the left represent the tiered wetland cells, and as we can see, those are higher in the blue, they're higher in that particulate nitrogen. And we suspect this relates back to the vegetation status of that tiered wetland. Because it is more sparsely vegetated, the soil is less protected, and so we expect to see more particulate and organic matter in the water. As for the upper wetland, that is much higher in that orange dissolved nitrogen, and this indicates that it may be impacted by agricultural runoff. Again, those high nitrate or dissolved nitrogen concentrations indicate to us that that upper wetland is being impacted by fertilizer runoff. In these graphs, I have again depicted the nutrient concentrations over time for a representative wetland cell from each wetland. The upper wetland is in green, the tiered wetlands in blue, and those orange bars simply represent when rain fell. The main point from these slides is simply that that green line is so much higher for the upper wetland than the blue line for the tiered wetland, as you can see from that graph on the left. From the graph on the right, we also see that the total nitrogen content is higher in that upper wetland. Overall, after looking at our nitrogen data, we came to the conclusion that the wetlands are serving to remove nitrogen. In the case of the tiered wetland, we came to this conclusion because those nitrate concentrations are so low, indicating that denitrification is occurring. In the case of the upper wetland, while those nitrate concentrations are elevated, they do decrease over time and across the wetland. And so we suspect that both wetlands are in fact removing nitrogen. We then move on to perform a similar analysis with phosphorus. We here again have the total phosphorus content for each wetland broken down into dissolved reactive phosphorus, or phosphate, in orange, and particulate phosphorus in blue. Again, the tiered wetland cells are on the left. They are those 3 bars on the left, and the upper wetland cells are the 4 bars on the right. Again, we see in this case that the tiered wetland is higher in the particulate form of the nutrient with a greater amount of blue. And we suspect this again relates back to that vegetation status and the fact that that soil is less protected, indicating that we would see more particulate matter in the water in that wetland. When we look at the upper wetland cells, being the 4 bars on the right, we see that the composition is much higher in the dissolved reactive phosphorus or phosphate concentrations. And again, that reflects the proximity of that wetland to those agricultural fields and the fact that it is most likely receiving impact from agricultural runoff. We see greater resuspension of phosphorus within the tiered wetland. In these graphs, I again have the nutrient concentration for a representative wetland cell. Again, the orange bars are when rain occurred, and the green represents the upper wetland, and the blue represents the tiered wetland. If we look at the graph on the left, that blue line will increase with the rain event, and we suspect this points to, again, that the tiered wetland is less protected in terms of its vegetation status. So when rain falls, we see resuspension of phosphorus from the particulate form in the soil into the water. Some other interesting observations to make with these graphs are that while the disparity between the phosphorus concentrations for the soluble phosphorus on the left, while that disparity is still there between the upper wetland and the tiered wetland, it is not as great for phosphorus as it is for nitrogen. And then when we look to the graph on the right, we actually see that the total phosphorus content is greater for the tiered wetland than for the upper wetland. Finally, after reviewing all of our phosphorus data, we did not come to a definitive conclusion on whether these wetlands are serving to remove phosphorus or not. In these graphs, I have the phosphate, soluble phosphorus, concentration for each wetland cell within each wetland, and those cells are just represented by different colored lines. Again, there's a lot going on in these graphs, but the main takeaway is that we do not see any definitive trend. The lines intersect at multiple points. There's no definitive increasing or decreasing seen here. And so the wetlands may serve to remove and accumulate phosphorus over time, but we're not able to come to that conclusion with the sampling time frame that we had. And so after this brief investigation into these 2 constructed wetlands, we were able to determine that they do serve to remove nitrogen, but that we're unsure on the ability of these wetlands to remove phosphorus during these months. And then we saw some interesting differences between the wetlands, with that upper wetland being impacted by agricultural runoff to a greater extent than the tiered wetland, and that upper wetland also having more vegetation and more bioavailable nutrients. I would like to thank everyone who made this research possible. And now I'll take questions.
Faith, just for people to understand clearly what was going on. So that tiered wetland, so the upper wetland, you had water flowing in and water flowing out, right?
Yes. To be clear, the upper wetland had flow observed in it across the sampling locations, but the tiered wetland, this is upper wetland. So the upper wetland had water flow observed down through this wetland, the slough into the deep basin, out through this drainage pipe. We saw active water movement within this wetland. The tiered wetland was, we did not ever observe surface flow here. So we had water in this cell and in some of these cells, but there was no flow.
So, but there was more water, the water fluctuated during the summer.
Yes, but there was a greater fluctuation in the water level within this wetland. This cell up here, we were only able to get 1 sample from that cell during the course of the sampling period because we had very dry conditions there. And then we had a rain event and we were able to collect some water. But generally, we saw, a huge fluctuation in conditions within this wetland. Yeah.
I have have a question for you from Dr. Liz Hassenmuller.
Mm-hmm.
She says, how did you differentiate between lower nitrogen levels because of loss via denitrification versus potential for dilution by rainfall?
So we were not able to really speculate on what or which way, or that, essentially that question, only that denitrification may have occurred just over the entire course of the summer.
Yeah, when you compare here in the upper one to the tiered wetland, and it might have been hard for people to see it, the tiered wetland, how much nitrate was in that water in the tiered wetland? It was like almost none, right? Right there, yeah.
Basically nothing.
Yeah.
Those nitrate levels were just very, very low.
So Liz is probably right, and we didn't really talk about it. There could, in the upper wetland, there could have been some dilution because you had water flowing in. But that lower one, the bars, I mean, the line is along the zero line. So right there is evidence that denitrification, because there's no nitrate there, very little.
Yes.
I know Annette mentioned some spraying of invasive species. Were there any other types of management activities? Like are these wetlands? I may have missed it earlier. Were they, any goals in terms of wildlife management? Like, any like drawdowns or anything like that?
I believe the tiered wetland is close to the end of its 7-year period of management, if that's correct. So there's, I believe, some baseline monitoring going on, but no like active conservation changes.
You don't think there's any wildlife monitoring? They look at the vegetation.
Yeah, we study wetlands too, and it's really difficult to do a mass balance on where does the phosphorus and where do the nutrients go.
Mm-hmm.
The organization we were working with, we're not even able to do a mass balance on the water. We were missing, how much was it, Jacob? 10% of the water was just disappearing.
There's other senior drainage systems.
So these wetlands can be very tricky to monitor and to evaluate. But I think you did a great job just showing what happens with the nitrogen.
Thank you.
We do have one more question from Megan Johnston. I think you kind of already addressed it right after she asked it, but she said, was the measurement for nitrate for the tiered wetland 0 or just really low?
Yes, that is something I forgot to mention in the presentation. It's just that there is nitrate there, but it's very, very low, especially compared to the upper wetlands. So it's not in fact 0, but it appears that way on the scale just because of the huge discrepancy.